ES Audio.
Right, get your pens ready, here's a history lesson, and we will be asking questions later. The first proper book known to have been written was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a poetic biography of a Sumerian king. The oldest known copy was made around 2000 BC. The printing press was invented in 1436. The first publishing house was the Cambridge University Press, founded by Henry VIII in 1534. And you know what? The practice of publishing has barely changed since then.
In the realms of how to be a CEO, there is an art to coming in and looking at something that already exists. And how far do you balance, okay, what have we got now versus where do we want to be in the future?
Wil Harris is the CEO of Unbound, a digital publishing house with the intention of disrupting one of our oldest industries.
Of course, nobody wants to be disrupted, right? So you sort of have to do it with a friendly face.
I'm David Marlison from the Evening Standard. Publishing may be old, but it's following principles that have been around for centuries and has been doing just fine. So when we meet Wil, I want to know, why does publishing need disrupting?
So first of all, thanks for having me, David. It's a great question. Publishing has been around for obviously a very long time and arguably hasn't changed that much at all from hundreds of years ago. In fact, I was just reading a book all about marketing books in the Middle Ages and the very first books coming off the Lutheran printer presses. And I was sort of thinking, gosh, this sounds awfully familiar, actually. I think, like everything, publishing is an industry that's going through an element of digital disruption. You know, I've seen it in former lives that I've had in the television world. I've seen it in the magazine and newspaper world. And books have been quite resilient to it in that they've really undergone not much of a change apart from the fact that we can now buy books digitally and read them on Kindles or on iPads. You can argue that the biggest disruption in publishing really in the last 20 years is the audiobook, right? That Audible model of buying a subscription to just get a book rather than sort of buying an individual book. That's quite disruptive. But I think there are a number of reasons that publishing is ripe for disruption now. I mean, one is that we are spending so much of our time online that it makes sense to have a sort of closer relationship between our online lives and our offline lives, and books are about as offline as it gets, really. I think the second thing is that I think we're all recognizing in today's world a greater need for diversity. You know, publishing is still particularly over here, it's a pretty middle class industry. It's a world where we could be doing a lot better to elevate a lot of different voices. You know, the Sunday Times bestseller list is often dominated by the same few names. It's also an industry where you're seeing a lot of consolidation. The big publishers are sort of, merging together. Amazon obviously has become such a huge force in our lives, not just for books, but for everything else. And I think anytime you have all those forces coming together, there's an opportunity to do something new and different and a little bit revolutionary. And that's why we like to think Unbound exists.
There's a couple of things there that you talked about that I would consider to be quite difficult. The first is the traditional world of publishing. How do you disrupt something which may not want to be disrupted? And then the second there is, of course, that Amazon feature, which so dominates everything. How do you work alongside something like that in that environment?
Of course, nobody wants to be disrupted, right? So you sort of have to do it with a friendly face. And I mean, I think that goes back to, kind of the way that Unbound works as a platform, as a company. So in many ways, we are a traditional publishing company, right? We have all the things that you'd expect a publishing company to have. But what we do that's different is that when it comes to commissioning a book, if somebody internally has got an idea for a book, if we've, had an author approach us and say they would like to write something, if we've thought of something that we would like to see happen in the marketplace, that actually we need to go and find an author or find a community, that's actually where we bring in the disruption. I always liken the traditional model to being a bit like spread betting, right? I'm going to take 10 horses and I'm going to bet, 20 quid on each of them. And, 9 of them won't win, but one of them will be such an outsider that it'll return enough to pay for all the rest of them combined, right? The way that we work is that when we decided to commission a book and we're working with an author and we've got a title and we've got, the idea and how it's going to work, We then take that out to our digital platform and let the crowd decide if it should be funded and if we should publish it. So it's kind of a little bit of a Kickstarter model. We put it up and say, if this book was going to be published this year, would you buy it? And that does a few things that really are very subtle. And that doesn't sound like a massive disruption, but it actually enables you to do quite a few things. It obviously financially de-risks what you're doing. So rather than making a bunch of bets that you're pretty sure are going to fail, every book is at least going to wash its own face. So you've got a great opportunity there. The second thing is you can see where those audiences are, where those readers are, where they gather. And you can actually try and drum up even more enthusiasm for a book than you would normally have. So, we publish books that appeal to the, people who are interested in video games, for example, and we can go and talk directly to those gaming communities and say, look, this is a book that we're making for you guys. Come and get involved. And the ways that they can get involved then also leans into some of the unique disruption that we do. So most publishers will sell you a book, and a book is great, but there are lots of people that would like more than a book. So in that sort of very Kickstarter-y way, we allow people to pledge for different sort of levels of engagement with the book. So you can just buy a copy of the book, maybe for a tenner, but for 20 quid, maybe you can buy a signed copy of the book. Or for £50, maybe you can buy a limited edition illustrated sort of art book that goes with the book. All the way through to, we've had authors who will put on lunches for people, all the way through to my absolute favorite at the moment, which is we're publishing a book with a fantastic woman who is a former Jehovah's Witness turned BDSM model, and which is quite a story. And for £1,000, she will record you a custom video to go with your book. And it's like, so you're giving people the chance not just to buy a book, but to really buy an experience that goes around the book and really to be part of it. So that's sort of an interesting sort of secondary disruption. But the third one actually really relates to, the point about our fantastic Jehovah's Witness BDSM model. She's a first-time author and as such is a pretty unknown quantity. So if you're a traditional publishing house, that's quite a big risk to take. Whereas we were able to say, okay, well, we know you have a certain, online community or a social media community. We know we can make this work. And actually the model of crowdfunding these books means that we can take much more riskier and much more diverse bets than you would otherwise be able to take in the publishing industry. So we're able to do things like we have an entire imprint of books called Unbound Firsts, which is just dedicated to publishing the debut novels of underrepresented writers. And that's something that's, we're really proud of. It's something that you can do when you've got a disruptive business model. Via the disruptive business model, we're able to give those people voices. And actually that makes the whole world of publishing a better place, I think.
Interesting that you're kind of heading into niche communities and marketing within those, because I think I may be wrong here, but is that bringing in people who might not ordinarily consider books or buy books? You're going, look, we're doing this thing that works with inside your community and the interests you have. Is that bringing new readers in?
So the short answer is yes, it is. Our average reader is younger than the average age of a book purchaser quite significantly. You're right. The internet was built for niche communities, right? It's where, everybody assembles, whether they're assembling on social media, whether they're assembling on subreddits. And sort of by its nature, publishing is designed to be broad. You want a bestseller. It's like, well, you've got to appeal to as many people as possible. And if you're only appealing to a small community, how do I really measure the size of that community? How do I know they're really going to be engaged? Well, guess what? If you get them in at the very beginning of the process, as we do, you can make sure they're engaged. And not only can you, tailor something to them, but you can find out where more of them are and actually build a business. And you'd be surprised how many niches are really not that niche. I mean, to take a complete, parallel from a different world, it's only 15 years ago that the idea of making a movie about Iron Man, one of the lesser sort of known, sort of very geeky comic book characters, that was considered quite a speculative bet in Hollywood, right? And look how niche that community of people turned out to be, right? So niches can always be bigger than you think they are. And I think, although we do publish in niches, we do have a few books that appeal to these kind of very broad but specific interest groups. So next year we have a a book which is called 42, which is a compendium of all the unpublished writings of Douglas Adams, who obviously wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, taken from us far too soon, sadly, but who left an office that was sort of an Aladdin's cave of 6x4, notes and half-written emails and half-outline stories. You can say that sort of sci-fi fans or, Hitchhiker's fans are a niche, but they're a pretty big niche, and you can make a good living, being nice to them.
And I guess this would be true for any new publisher, but how do you attract those authors? People like, you're working on this Douglas Adams book. That's a big name. He's now late, of course, but it's a big name you have. You've got, Jim Watt, Vic Reeves. He's a big, big name. How do you attract people in there? Because there is risk. This is a new model. It's perhaps unproven. Why should I publish my book through you when I've got one of the big 5 publishers interested in buying this?
So I think one thing is that we offer you a much more, as an author, we offer you a much closer relationship to your community. If you're writing for a traditional publishing house, your relationship is with your editor of that publishing house. And then the person at the publishing house has a relationship with Amazon, and then Amazon has a relationship with your reader. Whereas with the Unbound model, okay, if this book happens, somebody that you want to be your reader has got to pay for it, to fund it. And so you've immediately got that relationship. We allow authors to publish updates to the people who have pre-ordered or pledged for the book. They get access to be able to send them messages. We will be, without pre-announcing anything, allowing authors to build communities on the Unbound platform over the coming months that allow them to directly communicate with their readers. And that's a really important thing for an author to kind of, I don't want to say own because nobody owns somebody else, but to own their own audience and not have that data be trapped in another platform like Amazon. So I think that's number one. Number two is that because we've built this model that substantially de-risks the initial publishing run, it means that we can give authors much better commercial terms than they would otherwise get on, at some of the traditional publishers. If Unbound exists for a reason, it exists to connect audiences and authors. But also it exists because authors don't necessarily get a very fair shake from your traditional publishers. I mean, if you are J.K. Rowling and you've published Harry Potter, then of course you're making absolutely gazillions and you're set. But there are lots of authors who will publish things that will never make back their advances and will never see a sort of penny out of royalties down the road. And we have a different model of paying out royalties that sort of reflects a much more equitable, we think, split of kind of money really going between us and going between the author. And that in turn allows the author to have a more sustainable life. It allows us to not just recruit authors that are already financially secure and so probably come from a particular demographic. It means we can diversify our author base. It means we can bring diversity to the people that are creating books that might not have created them before. And it means that when they do create a book, they're getting a better return out of it. So they'll come back and work with us again.
Are you working differently with different kind of tiers of authors, your first time authors, your debut authors? Are they getting offered the same kinds of deals as some of a bigger name? How are you treating new authors and more traditional authors differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair question. And the way that it's traditionally dealt with in publishing is you sort of fundamentally have the same percentage of royalties paid out, but you might be given a bigger advance. And so what we're really trying to do is come up with contracts. And of course, we've got different contracts for not just, I don't want to say tiers of authors, but of course for different sectors, because different sectors perform differently. So what we want to try and always do is have, for any given sector, whether it's a cookbook sector or whether it's a video games book, or we want to try and have what we think is a fairer contract than any other competing publisher would give, along with all the advantages of we discussed about access to an audience and and that direct community aspect.
Let's take a break. Why not grab a coffee and read a short story? Oh, and hit your follow button so you never miss an episode of How to Be a CEO. We'll be back after these.
Let's talk about Unbound itself, because this is a publisher. It's not a self-publisher. You've talked about the staff that you have, the commissioners, and you release actual books as well, don't you? It's not just for e-readers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's a slight misnomer to describe us as a digital publisher, because we do publish things physically. We just happen to operate a very, very neat and very unique digital platform. You know, the great thing about disruption to an industry is that it doesn't always have to be subtractive. You know, you can add things on. So yes, we have this crowdfunding element, and yes, we do these really cool digital editions, but you can also buy books direct from our website. You can physically go into Waterstones. If you're in the States, you can go into Barnes and Noble and physically pick up very beautifully created. Our production team works very hard to make sure that the books that we create are fantastic, whether they're black and white, you know, novels, or whether they're full-size color coffee table books. They are, beautiful physical things.
In publishing itself, your own background isn't entirely within the publishing industry or the book publishing industry. How has that industry reacted to your arrival, I guess? Has it been welcoming for you?
Yeah, so I've had a career that's always been digital combined with something media. So I started off building one of the UK's first YouTube production companies. So this was kind of like digital, but with a little side of television. And I ran the digital operation at Condé Nast, which obviously publishes Vogue and GQ. And so that was digital with sort of magazines. And then I actually had a podcast company called Entail, and that was digital with a side of radio. So I feel like I'm sort of progressively getting more old fashioned. I've gone from sort of YouTube to magazines to radio and now to books. So I'm kind of going backwards in length of time. But I think everybody, you know, in this industry recognizes that disruption is needed, that there is opportunities that aren't being capitalized on. And I think everybody recognizes that the status quo isn't necessarily going to be the best way to take advantage of that. I like to think that because I've worked across a variety of industries now that have all had this kind of substantial level of digital disruption, I can work with people to sort of work alongside them. You know, the typical picture of somebody who comes in from the digital industry, you know, is the sort of Silicon Valley tech bro who comes in with a hoodie and his high tops and is like, you're all rubbish, you're doing it all wrong, you're all outdated, you're all fossils, sod off, we're going to do everything completely new from now on, because you might have been doing it for 20 years, but you don't know nothing about what's going on now, right? Not a very helpful approach. And what I've found over the years is that whether you're working in digital, in television or in radio or in magazines or indeed in books, showing people the advantages of what you can get out of digital and the advantages of this disruption, as opposed to just the sort of negatives that they will nevertheless experience, is actually a great way of getting people on board and bringing them along with you on this transformative journey. You know, you can say, okay, we're going to disrupt book publishing, but look what you get out of this. You've got all this incredible data about what people want to inform your commissioning decisions. Or look what else you can get. You can, you know, by having a direct to consumer relationship, maybe by launching a subscription model, you can get incredible marketing data that you never would have had before. You would have been relying on, you know, your sort of Amazon stats or the sort of slightly wonky stats of tube adverts for books and, you know, that kind of thing. It's about showing people that there are advantages and blessings to disruption, not just inconveniences and annoyances.
But if you're showing them success, Will, and the industry's looking at this, isn't there a risk that right now you're running more or less competitor free, but, you know, some big major company like Hachette or something could go, do you know what, why don't we just do it ourselves? And then is there a risk of increased competition here? And how do you stay ahead of that?
Well, I mean, that's the risk of running any disruptive business, right? Is that you have a bigger player that decides they want to do the same thing that you're doing. In fact, in any industry, that's the case. But the example I would specifically give in digital is, you know, Facebook has got a social network, and it turns out that people really want to do photos rather than text. And it's like, well, Facebook, of course, could do its own thing, but it's way easier to just acquire Instagram, you know, drop a couple of billion and you're onto that. And it's like, well, Facebook has built a messaging app, but it turns out Facebook isn't really built to build messaging apps. So actually, let's just buy WhatsApp because that's just a lot easier than doing it that way. So not to say that, we're only building something because it's there to be acquired in the future, but just to say that just because a big publisher or a big company can throw money at a problem doesn't mean they can solve it. The key things that smaller companies, that startups have, and it's, as a CEO, you've got to recognize your strengths and weaknesses. Our weakness is that we don't have the cash to deploy that a bigger company does. But our strength is greater focus, greater mission, better people, better determination, a clear goal. And also, we're not trying to internally compete. I've seen what it's like when you work in big companies and the digital division is competing against a more traditional division. The internal competition can be more divisive and more destructive than the external competition. There's a saying when you're doing a startup that an idea is worth precisely diddly squat. It's all about, there's a reason that you can't patent an idea, right? You literally can't legally patent an idea. You can only patent the execution of an idea. And it's all very well for a big publisher to say, hey, that's a good idea, we're going to copy that. Doing it's a lot harder.
How do you evolve, though? I mean, you've only been in the position a few months as we're doing this recording now. When you started, would you focus on, right, what are we going to be doing right now? Or is your focus on where do we go in 1, 2, 3 years' time?
So that's a great question because, in the realms of how to be a CEO, there is an art to coming in and looking at something that already exists when you're a CEO that's been brought in, right? And how far do you balance, okay, what have we got now versus where do we want to be in the future? I've done this a couple of times now, and there's a process that you kind of go through of, okay, what are the bits in this business that are really working? If you had to just leave everything else and just focus on a core, what would you do? And you want that element to be running like just in absolute tip-top condition. So kind of job one is, what's at the core of what we've already got? And how do we get that running the most efficiently that we possibly can? And for us, that was, look, we've got a great high quality book publishing operation that's got this unique flywheel that drives it with the consumer interaction. If we had to make sure that over the next 6 months to a year, we come out of that with that in the best position possible, then we have to focus on, that's job number one. But job number two is, where do we see this in 3 years? With the state of the world right now, the horizon could be a mushroom cloud in 5 years. So I'm just not worried about that far ahead. But I think you've got to look at a 3-year time horizon and say, what would the best version of this business look like in 3 years? And so what are the things that I need to do right now? And then in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, etc., how do I work backwards from where I want to be in 3 years, where I think I could be in 3 years? How do I work that back to actions that I need to take on day one when I come into the business? How do I put into process, by day 30, the classic 30, 60, 90 plan for delivering anything new? And maybe I don't know the answer to what that 3-year looks like. Maybe there are 2 or 3 possible answers. So how do I start putting irons in fires now so that you can see which ones get hottest over the next 6 months and make that decision in 6 months' time? It's how do we shore up the thing that's really core to us right now? And then how do we give ourselves the most optionality to be where we think we want to be in 3 years' time?
What have you got reading on your bedside table right now, Wil? And make sure it's one of your own. Make sure it's one of your own.
It is. I am currently reading, I find very therapeutic. I have a great book that we've just published called Birds by Jim Mower, who is the comedian known as Vic Reeves. And he's a fantastic watercolor painter. And he's drawn a whole bunch of the sort of indigenous British bird species. And there's a little cute little fact to go with every single one of them. And it's a great little bedside book to just, if you're sitting in bed and you've put your phone in the other room because you're practicing good sleep habits, even though I'm a digital native and putting my phone in the other room is almost like cutting off my arm. It's great to sit with and leaf through with your cup of cocoa. And it's a very pleasant little artifact to go through. So I would say Birds by Jim Mower is good. Oh, a great book called The Fantastic Four Complete Collection by James Hickman. which sadly isn't one of mine. But having mentioned the Marvel Universe earlier, it's the definitive run of the Fantastic Four, and that's a great little read as well.
That was Wil Harris from Unbound. Do you know where else you can get interviews, news and analysis? The Evening Standard newspaper, or go online to standard.co.uk/business. How to Be a CEO is back on Monday morning. Let's meet up again then.